Now it's time for our wrap-up. Let's give it everything we've got. Ready? Begin.
All right, y'all. Welcome back to the final day of our first week during our coronavirus courses online. So this is R5.3, and it'll be the first, or I say it's the last of the first rotation. So I know it's only 3 days, but we're gonna go ahead and move into something else next week, and that way the numbering just lines up, right? So that on Monday it'll be rotation 6, and it'll be 1 through 5 on those days. Next update is that I'm going to really try today to make the videos shorter. I know it's Friday, so we'll try to keep this one short. Maybe there'll only be 1 or 2 videos. We'll see how the break works. And then hopefully you've done the journal. If you haven't done the journal that was due yesterday, just make sure you do in fact submit that. I'm going to be a little bit more flexible on the due dates there. But a couple other updates. Some of you asked in the chat when the first test will be. The tests for this class will always be on a Thursday. So a week from yesterday, on Thursday, you'll have your first test for this class. Okay? And the test, again, it'll be online. So not too different than what we were already doing. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Song of the day is Radiohead's Everything in Its Right Place from the 2001 album Kid A. Pretty cool moment in rock history. If you're familiar with Radiohead, they had a huge hit in 1997 with, or 1998, depends on when you count, with the release of OK Computer, arguably one of the best rock albums of all time. And then they do a pretty big switch and go into Kid A, which is more of an electronic sound. But anyway, the reason that we're looking at Everything in Its Right Place from Radiohead today is that that's kind of what we're going to talk about with discernment and the spiritual exercises today, is that the goal is to get everything in your spiritual life in its right place before you start making these big decisions, right? And so next week we're actually going to start taking a look at marriage and family life and the vocation to the married life, right? If you think you're called to that, well, before you make your big decisions with those things, who you're going to marry, if you should get married, you want to know what's going on in the spiritual life as well. And you want to make sure everything in your spiritual life is in its appropriate and right place. So if you remember yesterday, we talked about the first 5 rules of Ignatius's rules for discernment. And the idea being that, you want to know if you are a guy going from mortal sin to mortal sin. If you are, certain rules apply, right? If you're a guy striving for holiness and you know that you are that, then certain rules apply. And you can start discerning whether or not it's the good spirit working in your life or the evil spirit working in your life. And again, it doesn't matter if you're a good guy or a bad guy, both spirits are going to be working on you at certain points. And that's Ignatius's point as well with consolation and desolation, right? That if you find yourself in consolation, don't think, oh, it's because I'm such a good and perfect, holy person that you're in consolation. It's just that God has allowed you to be in consolation in this moment. And if you find yourself in desolation, don't think, oh, it's because I'm such an unholy, bad person. You might actually be a very good person and on the right path, but God is allowing you to be in a moment of desolation so that eventually you can grow into the kind of being that He's calling you to be. And that was the main point from yesterday, right? Is that God desires you to become like Himself, and therefore, He'll take His hand away at certain points to allow you to become like Him, independent of those encouragements and doing the right thing simply because it's the right and good thing. So Ignatius gives us a few more rules then, at least to start off for today, with moments of desolation, right? If you find yourself in a moment of spiritual darkness, you're feeling distant from God, what are some ways that you can keep doing the right thing even in that spiritual darkness? And so you'll see on the board here 6 through 7 or 6 through 8, and they all have to do with desolation. So the first thing he says is this: if you're in desolation, don't stop praying. In fact, do even more prayer. Do more penance. And Lent is a great time to emphasize this point, right? It doesn't mean that what you were doing is bad. It just means that if you're in desolation, put into practice. I think it's the next slide, or the slide after that, we're going to have the Ray Allen, basketball example again. That if you're in a shooting slump, right, or if you're playing baseball, because I know baseball, at least college and pros is either canceled or delayed, right? If you're in a slump where you just can't get a hit and you're constantly striking out, well, you don't give up, right? You get more BP in, right? You take more practice, because if you're in a slump, the only way to get out of the slump is to keep doing the things that will lead to successful, playing of whatever sport you're in. It'd be really weird, right? Like if you've got the yips. I don't know if you remember any of you guys that have had the yips, but when I was playing baseball, this is way back when. This is at Metairie Playground. One of my friends, he really did have the yips, and he was a catcher, a very good catcher. He played baseball for Jesuit and was a catcher, and he couldn't throw the ball back to the pitcher, right? So we're not even talking about he couldn't, take off the helmet and pick a guy off at first, second, or third. We're talking he couldn't throw the ball back to the pitcher. And he got benched and then ultimately quit baseball. Now, it turns out he was better at other sports. But the point being is that the thing that you don't do if you're struggling in your sport is you just give up, right? Well, the same thing is true in the spiritual life. I think sometimes when we have a great moment like Kairos, we have these great moments of consolation. When we hit desolation, because we thought that the consolation was our doing, we think the desolation's our doing, and we kind of give up. Like, oh, if I'm not good at this, I'm not good at it. Or if I prayed a little bit and it didn't work, and I'm still in desolation, it must not work. Well, again, no great athlete thinks like that. In fact, they do the opposite. If they're in a slump, they're going to keep practicing. I know Drew Brees said recently that if he throws an interception, he's excited to go target that safety or corner, whoever picked him off, because he wants to prove it to him, like, you got lucky that time. I'm going to come after you again. And that's the kind of the mindset you want to think about in desolation, is that, okay, I'm in desolation, but I'm not going to give up. In fact, I'm going to get even more focused, right? And so just remember, then with that in number 7, it doesn't mean that God has abandoned you. In fact, it's the opposite. God is still present with you, even in the desolation. Although it feels like he's distant from you, he's not actually distant from you. And that's another point to emphasize the difference between the material realm of reality and that belief as a second mode of access into the unseen things. That God is still present even if we can't feel him in that moment. And so the natural powers, the physical realm, might feel desolate, right? But don't forget that God is still with you. And then finally, number 8, and this is really important, desolation is not forever. No matter who you are, you will not always be in desolation, right? It will eventually change. And that hopefulness can kind of guide you in these dark moments, that at some other point, you will experience consolation again. When? I don't know, right? But you will. The same thing to our first analogy there, right, with baseball or sports, is that you will get out of the slump at some point. I don't know when. When the Pelicans went on that, or whatever it was, 12 or 13 game losing streak, it kind of felt like we might never win a game again. Well, we did, right? And up until last week, we were 3.5 games out of the playoffs. You're gonna get out of desolation. Be patient. Do the right things. Don't give up hope, right? And remember, God is with you. And eventually, you will, in fact, experience consolation again. And then this picture right here in the background, that's just Notre Dame's chapel. And it's been a place of consolation for me in my life, but maybe you want to think in your life, where is a place of consolation that you can remember in times of desolation, right? Okay. Now, when we said that there's no connection or very little connection between being a good and holy person and then in being in desolation, I always was trying to put a little asterisk there, and the 9th rule kind of gives us the explanation of that asterisk, right? Is that there are some reasons why you might be in desolation, and so Ignatius says, some of them is that some of them are our fault, right? They actually come about because we're doing something wrong, and so he says one of them is that we might just be lazy in our spiritual exercise. So if you know, laziness usually leads to more laziness. Like if you are someone that procrastinates, you probably tend to increasingly procrastinate. And if you spend the entire day just watching Netflix or something, you probably have very little motivation to go out and do other things, and you're probably more motivated to remain watching Netflix. Well, the same thing is true in the spiritual life. If you are spiritually lazy and it's like, I don't feel like praying, I don't feel like going to mass, chances are you're going to stay in that laziness. And that's when we get back to rule number 6. Well, if you find yourself in that, get up and go pray. Get up and go do something spiritually nourishing to get out of that habit. The second one, all right, you can see here, is that maybe it really is a trial to see, will you stay faithful to God even in desolation? A great example of that, and I may have talked about this yesterday, is from the book of Job, that God allows Job to be tempted by the devil. God allows Job to have bad things happen to him because God is so confident that Job will still be faithful to God. And the devil's like, no, he's not. The devil says, he's only faithful to you because you've done good things for him. As soon as you take away those good things, he's going to abandon the faith. And the story goes, Job remains faithful even in the hardships, right? Now, this one, number 2, is it's going to come about when you're already on the path of holiness, right? And we talked about that growing into the man God wants you to be, the kind of creature that God desires you to be, right? So that's going to come about usually when you're already on the path to holiness. And then 3 is almost, that's the one where you really are in that path to sainthood. And think again like Mother Teresa or Therese of Lisieux from their journals, where God has allowed his hand to be taken away so much so that then your entire vision is reoriented to realize that without God, nothing is possible. And this is one of Ignatius's big insights when he says, like God is in all things. He doesn't mean it pantheistically, like God is literally in the tree or God is in the wind, right? But that without God's presence, without God being behind all of the created order, it wouldn't exist. And so in these moments of desolation, you actually recognize the goodness of all creation, the goodness of God, all of the blessings that you've been given because of their absence, right? They say absence makes the heart grow fonder. The principle is the same here, right? When God's hand is removed from you and you feel like you're distant from him, you think even more deeply or even more gratefully about the times when he was in fact close. Behind here we've got the image of Rocky training. So again, if you feel spiritually lazy, get up and get praying. Okay, the 10th rule, and then maybe we'll pause the video here and we'll pick up another video in just a little bit. The 10th rule is remember that in times of desolation, you will be in consolation again, and when you're in consolation, remember that you will be in desolation again. It's kind of this both and here, right? That if, let's say again, this is Ray Allen sinking the shot against the Spurs to win the NBA Finals for LeBron the first time around. I don't know if you remember that or not, but it's a pretty crazy shot. It looked like the Spurs were on the brink of winning the championship, and then Ray Allen makes this corner 3. It's pretty crazy. Again, was not a Miami Heat fan, not a LeBron fan at the time, but still an amazing shot. And the idea is that if you're making a lot of shots, if life is going well for you, if consolation seems to be all about you, remember you will be in desolation again. And that consolation is good, but it's not going to last. And remember, C.S. Lewis said the constancy of human life is not that you're always in consolation or you're always in desolation. The constancy is that you're always going to fluctuate between the two. So you don't want to necessarily store it up, but you want to keep that memory in the back of your heart and mind so that when you are in desolation, you remember, wait a second, I'm in desolation right now, but I was in consolation, and I will be in consolation again, okay? And then the same thing is true when you're in desolation. When you're in desolation, remember, you will be in consolation again. You will make the shots again if you're in a slump, and we already talked about that point. Okay, so what I want you to do right now is pretty similar to what we did yesterday, but now that we've got a little bit more details, I want you to reconsider a moment when you were either in consolation or a moment when you're in desolation, and then kind of use this as a framework, right? If you were in that consolation, well, how long did it last, right? How long did it stay? And then when did you go into desolation, and when did you come back into consolation? If you can think of more clearly a time when you're in desolation, how long did it last? And then did you get back to consolation again? And just start charting, has this pattern been evident in your life? Okay, so do that, write that on a sheet of paper, and then come back in the second video, and then I promise you that'll be the last video for today. All right, I'll see you in the next one.